Welcome to the Drawing Room Detectives, where mystery thrives in every shadow and deduction is our craft. Today, we delve into a case long buried beneath tide and time, a case Holmes himself once refused to document in his official annals. From a quiet Sussex village haunted by legends to a cave lit by unnatural lanterns, this is the tale of symbols carved in stone, secrets passed through bloodlines, and one man's obsession with a light best left unseen. This is The Adventure of the Widow's Lantern. Chapter 1. A Visitor in Mourning. It was on a wind-lashed morning in late October when Mrs. Hudson appeared at our sitting-room door, her expression pinched with polite disapproval, and something else, curiosity perhaps. "There's a lady here to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "A widow, I believe, dressed all in black, carries a lantern of all things." Holmes looked up from his violin, which he had been plucking in a desultory manner for the past half-hour. "A lantern, you say?" he echoed, setting the instrument aside. "Do show her in, Mrs. Hudson. Any visitor bold enough to carry her own illumination through London fog deserves an audience." Moments later, the door opened again, and in stepped a figure whose presence seemed to dim even the morning light. She was tall, pale, and severe, her dark garments rustling like dry sails. In her gloved hands, she clutched a storm lantern, nautical in design, copper-framed and sea-weathered. It clanked faintly as she set it on our table. "I am Mrs. Isla Merrow," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I've come from Dorset, from the coast." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite the fireplace. "Please, madam, tell us what brings you from sea to soot." She sat, her back ramrod straight, and glanced down at the lantern before meeting Holmes's gaze. "This belonged to my husband. He was a lighthouse keeper until he perished during a storm last winter. The sea took him, and the lamp was all that was returned to me." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "I'm sorry for your loss." "There's more," she said, her gloved fingers tightening. "I live alone now in the keeper's cottage below Dagger Point, a cliffside village you've likely never heard of. For months it's been quiet, until 2 weeks ago. That lantern began to light itself." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who remained still. "I'd leave it on the mantel, unlit," she went on. "But at night, when I woke, I'd see its glow through the cottage windows. At first, I thought I'd left a candle burning, but I've returned to find it warm to the touch, though no matches are used. And others, villagers, have seen the light shining from the cliff." "Could it be the work of a prankster?" I asked. She shook her head. "The lantern has never left my care. I keep it locked away when I leave the house, and the door shows no signs of disturbance." Holmes stood and examined the lantern closely, not touching it. "Curious. Not haunted, I think, but curious." He circled it, eyes narrowed. "You say the sightings coincide with no particular weather pattern or date?" She nodded. "Fog or clear, new moon or full. The light appears without reason or warning, and—" Here she hesitated. "There is a belief in the village that the lantern is guiding someone, or something." Holmes smiled thinly. "Superstition is often a veil for human intention, and intentions are my business, Mrs. Merrow." "I thought as much," she said. "I've read of your work. I trust you'll come." Holmes glanced toward the window where the fog pressed like the sea itself. "Dagger Point, you say? I've long wanted to see the southern cliffs in the off-season. Mr. Watson and I shall take the morning train." As she stood to leave, Holmes gestured toward the lantern. "Leave that with me. If it chooses to glow here, I'd like to be present." She left us with a rustle of black fabric and a faint scent of salt air. When the door closed behind her, Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eye. A widow, a self-illuminating lamp, and a remote cottage by the sea. What more could one ask for, Watson? I glanced at the lantern. It sat motionless, dull and unlit. A rational explanation, I murmured. That's all I ask. Holmes smiled. Then let's go find one. Chapter 2. A Light in the Fog. The train ride to Dorset was a long and brooding affair, spent beneath a sky the colour of slate. Holmes spent the majority of the journey studying Mrs. Merrow's lantern, which he had insisted on wrapping in a thick woolen shawl and placing carefully in the luggage rack above us. He examined it periodically with his magnifying glass, muttering now and then, tapping gently at the metal casing as though coaxing it to confess. "Do you detect some mechanical trick?" I asked, as the fields gave way to marshes and the sea began to scent the wind. "Nothing yet," Holmes replied without looking up. "No clockwork, no ignition mechanism, no trace of phosphorus. Curious. Then perhaps it is, as the widow fears, a haunting?" He gave me a look that was at once amused and pitying. "Watson, the dead have no need of lanterns." We arrived at the village of Dagger Point just before twilight. It was a wind-bitten place of low stone houses and crooked lanes, perched atop cliffs that seemed to lean eternally into the sea. The air was thick with salt and gull cries, and a faint mist hung above the ground like breath held too long. Mrs. Merrow was waiting at the station in a small trap, drawn by a mule with one lazy eye. She had changed into a dark green travelling coat, but her face remained pale and unreadable. "The fog rolls in quickly here," she said by way of greeting. "We should hurry." The ride to her cottage took us past the old lighthouse, no longer operational, its fire long extinguished, and down a steep coastal road that curled like a snake along the cliffs. The path was treacherous, and several times the mule balked at unseen dips in the road. "People don't come this way after dark," Mrs. Merrow said softly. "That's usually when the most interesting things happen," Holmes replied. Her cottage stood alone at the base of a rocky bluff, its chimney leaning slightly as if tired of the sea wind. It was sturdy, built of stone, and surrounded by waist-high dry grass that hissed in the breeze. From the moment we entered, I was struck by the interior's simplicity: wooden floors scrubbed clean, modest furnishings, a fire struggling in the hearth, and on the mantel above it a vacant hook. "That's where the lantern usually rests," she said. "But you have it, of course." Holmes placed the lantern on the mantelpiece and stepped back, observing it as though expecting it to leap into action. "Does anyone else have a key to this cottage?" he asked. "No," she replied. "I live alone. My husband died nearly a year ago, swept off the rocks during a storm." "Recovered?" "No," she said, her eyes darkening. "His body was never found." Holmes's expression flickered, just briefly, and I could tell he had filed that detail away. We spent the evening in observation. Holmes declined supper, instead prowling the small cottage like a cat, tapping floorboards, checking for draughts, and pausing often to gaze through the windows out to sea. The fog thickened quickly, swallowing the cliffs, until only the howl of distant surf marked the edge of the world. It was just past midnight when Mrs. Merrow, retiring to her room upstairs, called down to us in a whisper. "The light is back." Holmes sprang from his chair. We followed her gaze through the bedroom window, and I swear my breath caught. Out on the headland, perhaps 30 yards from the cottage, hovered a pinprick of light, not flickering like a lantern in hand, but steady, unwavering, and unnatural in its stillness. It gleamed like a star misplaced from the sky, standing alone in the mist. Holmes grabbed his coat and turned to me. "Stay here and keep watch from this window. If the light moves, shout." He vanished into the fog like a shadow unfastened from its owner. I stood by the window, heart pounding, watching that cold little light through the mist. Minutes passed. The house was silent. Then, without warning, the light blinked out. A shout rang through the fog, Holmes's voice, sharp and urgent. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, calling his name, but the fog was a wall. I could barely see my own feet. Somewhere ahead, footsteps scraped across stone, and then silence. At last, a shape emerged. Holmes, brushing himself off, a shallow cut across his cheek. "Are you hurt?" I asked, rushing forward. "Only my pride," he muttered. "The path beneath the bluff has been deliberately loosened." I fell halfway into a gully before I found my footing. "I think," Holmes said, his breath still ragged, "that someone very much alive is using the sea's reputation for ghosts to frighten people away." And though the lantern on the mantel never flickered that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching from the cliffs. Chapter 3: The Village Whispers. Morning came slowly to Dagger Point, dragged in beneath a grey sky and delivered on the wings of damp, salt air. The fog had lessened, though not lifted, and the sea muttered to itself like an old man dreaming. Holmes had slept little, if at all. When I awoke, he was already at the kitchen table, hunched over a sheet of foolscap, with his long fingers stained faintly with ink and soot. "A list of questions," he said without looking up, "and 3 possible answers to each. I dislike questions without framework." "Anything of interest?" I asked, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "Several things, chiefly why the light vanished precisely as I approached. It's not enough to say someone was watching, they would need to be close and invisible in that fog." "Could it have been a coincidence?" He gave me a sharp look. "Coincidence is the refuge of the uninspired." After a modest breakfast, we set off toward the village, which lay in a shallow dip between 2 rising cliffs. The streets were cobbled and damp, the homes simple and weathered, each crowned with a crooked chimney. The villagers we passed nodded politely, but with a touch of suspicion. Holmes's sharp eyes and London manner marked him at once as an outsider. We stopped first at the post office, a squat stone building that also served as general store, telegraph station, and rumour mill. Behind the counter sat a man with the face of a tired badger and the patience of one. "Morning," he muttered. "Good morning," Holmes returned pleasantly. "I'm looking for a Mr. Eli Creed. I'm told he's the sexton and something of a historian here." The man squinted. "Aye, that be Eli. Lives above the chapel. Mind the steps, though, they'll kill you faster than the sea." We thanked him and made our way to the chapel, which stood crooked on a small rise above the village. A narrow stair of worn stone led to a loft-like dwelling with a faded door. Holmes knocked, and after some shuffling within, the door creaked open to reveal a wiry man with a mane of white hair and an expression somewhere between suspicion and boredom. "I'm Creed," he rasped. "What do you want?" "To ask about the old lighthouse and the Merrow family," Holmes said. "And the light on the cliffs." The man's eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside. "You'd best come in." The loft smelled of salt, books and pipe smoke. Old charts hung on the walls, and a glass cabinet held pieces of shipwrecks, broken sextants, rusted compasses, and fragments of lifeboards. "You're the detective," Creed said, settling into a chair with difficulty. "The widow said you'd come." "What can you tell me about her husband's death?" He snorted. "The sea took him. Same as it's taken better men than him." Caleb Merrow was strong and clever, but he had an odd streak. Talked to the light as if it were a person. Used to say it knew things, that it warned him. "Warned him of what?" Holmes asked. Creed shrugged. "That's the bit he never said. Just muttered about the lantern knowing. Foolishness, if you ask me." Holmes tapped his chin thoughtfully. "And these sightings, have you seen the light yourself?" Creed hesitated. "Aye, once, about a fortnight ago. It shone through the fog like a ship's flare." but brighter, too steady for fire and too still. And it moved, Mr. Holmes, like a man holding it, except no man was visible, just the light. Then it vanished, poof, like it walked off the edge of the world. There was silence for a moment.
"Has the village always believed the lantern is cursed?" I asked.
Not cursed, guarded. The old story says the widow's lantern calls the sea to claim what's owed, that those who see it are marked. Marked for what? He didn't answer. On the way back, Holmes was quiet, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" I asked. That Creed saw something he doesn't fully understand, and that Caleb Merrow may have discovered something more than superstition on those cliffs. Do you believe someone is using the lantern to frighten the widow? Possibly, but that implies motive. What does Mrs. Merrow have that's worth all this? A memory or guilt? Holmes didn't answer at first, then softly. "We must watch the cliffs again tonight, but this time, Watson, we'll split up." Chapter 4. Below the Bluff. By the time dusk began to fall once more across Dagger Point, the wind had shifted, pushing the mist inland in slow, seeping tendrils. The sea was louder than the night before, crashing rhythmically against the crags below the headland. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent for much of the afternoon, seated beside the window with his long fingers steepled and his gaze fixed beyond the hills. At precisely 7 o'clock, he turned to me with sudden decision. "Tonight, Watson, we must divide our efforts. If the lantern appears again, I intend to follow it, not from the cliffs as I did last night, but from below." "Below?" I echoed. "The tide will be low just before midnight," he replied, already fastening his boots. "There's a path, largely forgotten, that cuts along the underside of the bluff. Narrow, yes, but passable, and quite possibly revealing. You'll go alone?" He paused. "I shall be joined by a companion who owes me a favour, Inspector Talbot of the local constabulary. He'll meet me near the base of the trail. Your place is here, in the upstairs room, with Mrs. Merrow. If the lantern appears, watch carefully. Make note of its behaviour, height, direction, whether it flickers. If it disappears again, time it. Every second matters." And so, as the clock in the village struck 10:30, Holmes left through the rear gate, his tall frame vanishing into the fog like smoke swallowed by a cold mouth. I returned to the small upstairs room, where Mrs. Merrow sat in a high-backed chair, wrapped in a shawl of storm-grey wool. She looked exhausted, but alert, her hands knotted together in her lap. "Do you believe it's a trick, Dr. Watson?" she asked softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the sounds of wind and surf. "I believe it is my friend's job to doubt what others accept," I said, "and mine to keep an open mind." She smiled faintly. A fair arrangement. We waited in silence. Minutes crept by. 11 o'clock, 11:15. Then, as if conjured by some unseen cue, it appeared. The same steady light, unnatural, unmoving, burning just above the cliffs to the east, not close enough to show detail, but near enough to chill the spine. Unlike a lantern carried by hand, it remained unnervingly motionless. "There," I whispered. "Same place as before." Mrs. Merrow clutched the windowsill. "But no footsteps, nothing." I watched it carefully, counting the seconds. Holmes had taught me this much. Fear rushes the mind, but reason gives it form. Then the light twitched. It blinked once, briefly dimming, then moved laterally. Slowly, as though sliding along the air itself, not down, not toward the sea. "Left," I said aloud. "It's moving left." Then it vanished, just as it had before. No sound, no wind change, simply gone. I raced downstairs and out the back door. The cold night slapped me like a wave, and the grass was slick with dew. I listened, nothing but the low groan of the tide. Holmes did not return for nearly an hour. He emerged from the dark near the side fence, his coat torn, and his boots caked with seawater and grit. Talbot followed behind, holding what looked like a coil of rope and a small canvas satchel. "Well?" I demanded. Holmes held up a finger, catching his breath. "It's real," he said at last. "Not a trick of fog or moonlight. Someone placed a structure, thin metal, about 8 feet tall, on a natural ledge just below the bluff. A pivoted arm was used to extend the lantern from the cliffside so that it would appear to float." "An illusion?" I said. "A very good one," Holmes replied, "but not supernatural." Talbot stepped forward. "We found tracks on the lower path. Someone's been accessing it from the western side of the bluff. Clever too. Hidden behind a bramble thicket and marked with only 2 stones. Why go to such trouble?" I asked. Holmes looked at Mrs. Merrow, who had stepped out onto the porch with a candle in her hand. "Because," he said, "someone is trying to frighten you into leaving this place, and given how elaborate their methods are, they're growing desperate." He turned back to me, his eyes sharp as flint. "Tomorrow, Watson, we visit the solicitor who handled Caleb Merrow's affairs. I want to know what's buried deeper than just a husband lost to the sea." Chapter 5: The Will and the Widow. The following morning, the fog had lifted, and for the first time since our arrival in Dagger Point, the village was touched by sun. It fell over the headland in pale, slanted bands, washing the chapel roof in gold and throwing silver glints on the sea. Holmes, however, took no joy in the change of weather. He was up early, as always, and had commandeered the kitchen table where he sketched what he called a hypothesis of misdirection, a crude drawing of the cliffside, complete with lantern post and shadows. "The placement of the light," he explained, while adjusting his cuffs, "is not merely theatrical, it's strategic. Someone wanted it visible from the cottage, but not from the village, which suggests the intended audience is very specific, the widow alone. And the motive? That, Watson, is what we intend to uncover this morning." We made our way to the small legal office of Mr. Penfield, the local solicitor who had managed Caleb Merrow's affairs. It was a narrow brick building tucked between a bakery and a fishmonger's shop, and its interior was dark, dusty, and choked with paperwork. The man himself was tall, reed-thin, and wore spectacles that magnified his eyes to unnatural proportions. "You are here regarding the Merrow estate," he said without preamble. "I'd heard of your arrival." Holmes nodded. "Then perhaps you'll confirm something. Is the property still in dispute?" Mr. Penfield raised a brow. "No dispute, per se. The property was left to Mrs. Merrow, as expected. However, the deed has complexities." "Go on," Holmes urged. "Caleb Merrow inherited the house and land from his uncle, a reclusive man named Jonathan Merrow. Old Jonathan placed conditions upon the property, namely, that it never be sold, only passed down through blood or by marriage. If those conditions aren't met, the estate reverts to a trust held by a private entity known as Hargreaves and Blythe Holdings." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And has there been any attempt to challenge the widow's claim?" Mr. Penfield adjusted his glasses. "Not formally. However, I did receive an anonymous letter last week requesting a review of the deed. Claimed Mrs. Merrow was mentally unfit to manage the estate due to grief and instability." Holmes and I exchanged glances. "Was the letter signed?" I asked. "No, but it was typed and, curiously, the phrasing was clinical." "May we see it?" Holmes asked. Penfield retrieved a small file folder from a cabinet and handed it over. Holmes read the letter twice, frowning more deeply with each pass. Then he folded it precisely and slipped it into his coat. "A mimic," he said at last, more to himself than to us. Pardon? Penfield asked. Someone who imitates, someone who understands deduction but applies it to manipulation, a dangerous combination. Back at the cottage, Holmes laid the letter beside the one we had received upon our arrival, the one predicting the museum theft. The resemblance was uncanny. Same style, same clipped phrasing, even similar spacing between lines. This isn't just a taunt, Holmes said. It's a pattern. This person studies me, my methods, my logic, and now they're applying it to a very personal objective. You believe the person behind the letter is the same one who created the lantern illusion? I asked. I do. And more than that, I believe they've been planning this for some time. Just then, Mrs. Merrow entered the room, holding a weathered tin box. This arrived for Caleb the week before he died, she said, offering it to Holmes. He never opened it. I found it beneath the floorboards of his study after the funeral. I didn't want to look inside alone. Holmes took the box carefully and opened the lid. Inside were 3 items, an old nautical chart, a small brass key, and a folded letter addressed to Caleb. He opened the letter. As he read, his face darkened. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed it to me without a word. The letter was scrawled in jagged ink, and it read, "You've come too close, Caleb. The lantern was never yours to guard. Return the journal, or follow the others into the sea. There are depths below even you can't fathom." No name, no signature. Holmes stood, eyes fixed on the window, where the sea gleamed coldly in the light. "Watson," he said, "I believe someone is hunting secrets hidden not just in this house, but beneath it." Chapter 6. What Lies Below. There is a particular sharpness to seaside air at midnight. It cuts past clothing and skin and seems to settle in the very bones. That was the cold we stepped into as Holmes, Mrs. Merrow and I descended into the cellar below the cottage, guided only by a storm lantern and the clink of the brass key in Holmes's coat pocket. The door beneath the stairs had always been there, Mrs. Merrow said, but she had never found a key that fitted until now. The brass key, as it turned out, belonged to a small iron door tucked behind crates of long-forgotten preserves and fishing gear. Holmes swept aside the cobwebs, slid the key into the rusted lock, and turned. The bolt gave way with a reluctant groan. Beyond it, darkness. Cold, unmoving air drifted up from the black. Holmes lit a second lantern, handed it to me, and stepped inside. We followed a narrow, stone-lined passage that sloped downward, deeper than the foundation of any house had right to go. Sea-worn steps descended in a spiral, slick with damp, the sound of our boots echoing in quiet, eerie delay. "I believe we are beneath the cliff itself," Holmes whispered. "The bluff hides more than seabirds and superstitions." After perhaps 50 feet, the passage opened into a wide circular chamber, cut by hand by the look of it, and braced with beams gone half to rot. Sea mist curled along the floor like smoke. At its centre sat an iron hatch, bolted shut. Beside it lay a wooden crate, cracked but intact. Holmes moved quickly to the crate. He pried open the lid, revealing a collection of journals and maps, all bundled in oilskin. "Caleb's handwriting," Mrs. Merrow whispered, kneeling beside it. "These are his research notes." Holmes picked up one of the journals, flipping through brittle, densely written pages. His eyes moved faster than I could follow, absorbing symbols, sketches of underwater caves, annotations in Latin. "This was no idle curiosity," he murmured. "Caleb was tracking something beneath the channel. Old passages, perhaps, or older structures." Mrs. Merrow paled. "He told me once that our house stood over an older ruin, that when the tides were low and the winds calm, you could hear it groan." Holmes tapped the iron hatch with his cane. "This is no storm drain. It's an entrance, likely to a smuggler's tunnel, or something they repurposed from deeper times, and someone didn't want Caleb opening it." He stood and turned toward me. "The letter we read, return the journal or follow the others into the sea, it wasn't metaphor. I believe more than one person has come too close to whatever secret this place holds." Suddenly from the dark behind us, footsteps. Holmes extinguished the lantern in a heartbeat. We stood still, breath held. The echo grew louder, descending the same path we had taken. A shadow moved against the pale edge of the tunnel, slow, deliberate. Holmes motioned for silence. The figure stepped into view. It was Inspector Talbot. "Thank God," he whispered. "I've been looking for you." "There's been a break-in at the solicitor's office. Penfield was struck over the head. He's alive, but barely. And this was taken from his desk." He handed Holmes a torn envelope. Holmes opened it. Inside, another letter, typed. "You came too late. The past cannot stay buried. Let the widow go and this ends. Dig deeper and you join the drowned." The signature was chilling. Just a single character. "M," he said under his breath. "A monogram, or perhaps an initial familiar to more than one of my cases." I turned to him. "Do you think this connects to your other investigations?" His eyes were sharp now, not with excitement, but with understanding. "No, Watson, this one is different. This one is personal." Chapter 7. A Name from the Past. We returned to the cottage in silence, the lantern light bobbing like a ship's lamp on stormy water. The journals remained with Holmes, cradled tightly in his arms like a precious burden. Mrs. Merrow walked beside us, pale and shaken. Behind us, Inspector Talbot followed with an eye to every shadow, one hand never far from his revolver. Back inside, Holmes cleared the table in the sitting room and spread out the oilskin-wrapped contents of Caleb's journal crate. It smelled of seawater and old wood. With delicate precision, he arranged several maps, a few loose letters, and 3 volumes, each handwritten in Caleb Merrow's fastidious scrawl. The first volume bore a title in ink. Observations Beneath Dagger Point, Journal 1. Holmes opened it and began to read aloud, the room utterly silent. August 2nd, I followed the fault line down to the 3rd tier. The stones are older than the chapel and bear symbols similar to those described in the 1829 expedition log from Sussex. If I am correct, these may predate even Roman occupation. He flipped pages rapidly, scanning, murmuring. August 19th, the whispers continue. Only near the 3rd gate. It is likely acoustic, cave resonance, nothing more. Another page. September 3rd, I received a letter today, unsigned, warning me to abandon my search. Claimed I had disturbed the drowned covenant. I burned it. There are too many cowards in this town. Holmes looked up. Caleb wasn't just poking at local legend. He was uncovering something, and someone feared what he might find. I nodded slowly. "And that someone left the lantern as a warning?" "Yes," Holmes replied. "But not just to frighten, to isolate, to drive the widow into madness or submission, so the land and whatever secrets lie beneath it could be claimed by someone else." Mrs. Merrow flinched. "They want the house?" "They want what's under it," Holmes said, tapping the map with a bony finger. "There are passages, flooded ones, that lead to caverns long sealed by landslide and silt. Caleb believed one of those caves held a relic, possibly more." Inspector Talbot frowned. "What kind of relic?" Holmes gave him a hard look. "The kind men kill for." There was a silence then, heavy and long. Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the anonymous letter that had been sent to Penfield. He laid it beside the others, the one predicting the theft at the museum, the threat sent to Caleb, and now the most recent, signed only with the letter M. "Whoever this person is," Holmes said, "they've studied me. Perhaps even follow my career. The mimicry isn't just clever, it's practiced. And the use of M." He trailed off, then turned abruptly and went to his trunk by the fireplace. He drew out a flat folio bound in black leather and untied the laces. Inside was a series of older documents, scraps of paper, sketches, notes in Holmes's own hand. He pulled out a yellowing page and laid it beside the latest letter. My breath caught. The font was identical, the phrasing eerily so. Holmes spoke softly now, as though to himself. "Years ago, I dismantled a circle of forgers operating in East London. Among them was a youth, barely 16, but frighteningly adept at mimicry. Could imitate any handwriting, could replicate any pattern. He called himself Miles Varner, brilliant, unstable, vanished before the trial." Holmes paused, tapping the letter bearing the M. "I believe he's found a new stage for his illusions." Mrs. Merrow's eyes widened. "So? He's not a ghost, not some sea spirit?" "No," Holmes said. "Far worse. He's a man who understands shadows and how to wear them like a cloak." Talbot stood. "Then let's bring him in." Holmes raised a hand. "We can't. Not yet. We need proof. And leverage. If Varner is here, he's hiding in plain sight. That means someone in the village is harbouring him, or worse, working with him." A beat passed before Mrs. Merrow whispered, "There is one place Caleb never let me go, a shed behind the chapel. Said it was part of the old coast watch, locked, always." Holmes stood. "Then that is where we go next." But just as he turned toward the door, there was a knock, a single, deliberate knock. We froze. Holmes approached and opened the door. There, under the dim glow of the porch lamp, stood a boy, no more than 12. Wind-blown and pale. He handed Holmes a folded slip of paper and then ran off into the night. Holmes opened the note. It read, "You see, don't you, Mr. Holmes? You've always seen. But seeing doesn't save you. Not when the sea is rising." There was no signature, just a crude sketch of a lantern hung from a noose. Chapter 8. The Watchman's Shed. The lantern sketch burned in Holmes's mind as much as it did in ours. He turned it over once more by the fireplace, fingers tightening as though he might crush the paper entirely. I knew that look, the sharpening edge of Holmes's fury. Not an anger of violence, but of clarity. Focus. He was closing in. "Watson," he said abruptly, "we go now. Mrs. Merrow, if you please, remain here with Inspector Talbot. Bar the door the moment we leave and speak to no one until we return." Without another word, Holmes was into his coat, and I followed. The wind had changed, blowing hard off the sea and carrying a strange warmth, like breath through cracked stone. We marched quickly through the night, our footsteps muted by fog. The chapel loomed ahead, its silhouette broken only by the old bell tower and the crooked iron cross atop it. Behind the chapel, among brambles and wind-blown ivy, sat the shed. It looked like nothing. A structure forgotten, smaller than a garden house, its door swollen by rain and bound in iron straps now red with rust. But when Holmes ran his hand along the lintel, he found it, a hidden groove, fresh, and just beneath it, a false knot in the wood concealing a tiny mechanism. He pressed it. With a faint click, the lock gave. Inside the shed was not a shed. It was a descent. The wooden floor was only a hatch. Holmes flung it open, revealing a ladder that vanished into darkness. The air from below smelled of earth and something older, something untouched. Holmes lit his lantern. "He's been using this," he said softly. Down we went into a space carved directly beneath the chapel. The tunnel below wasn't like the cellar beneath Merrow House. This was older, much older. The walls were limestone, chipped by hand with tools that might have belonged to monks or smugglers or something more arcane. Strange, looping symbols had been scratched along the walls, some fresh, some impossibly ancient. After perhaps 30 yards, we emerged into a chamber lit by gaslight. A table stood at its centre, covered in photographs of Caleb Merrow, of Mrs. Merrow, of the cottage, of Holmes himself at Paddington Station, diagrams, maps, timelines. Holmes stepped closer and saw it then, a wall-sized board covered in lines of twine and pinned notes, stretching across months, possibly years. "This man," Holmes whispered, "has been watching me for quite some time." Then his eyes narrowed. A photograph hung dead center of the board, one I had never seen before. It showed Holmes on the deck of a ferry, taken at a distance but unmistakably him, head turned slightly toward the sea. Behind him, a figure blurred, almost ghost-like, in mid-step. Just enough detail to discern a coat. A shadowed face. I felt a chill. "He's been stalking you?" "Yes," Holmes replied, voice distant. "Or studying." I wonder now if this case began not with a stolen relic or a widow's lantern, but with a long-held obsession. He turned to a crate tucked into the corner, partially hidden by canvas. Inside were tools, pickaxes, chisels, vials of what looked to be formalin and ink. More strangely, there was an old diver's mask, cracked but functional, and a sealed journal marked with a symbol I did not recognize, a triangle within a circle surrounded by tiny dashes. Holmes opened the journal. Inside were sketches of submerged ruins, floor plans of cavernous vaults, and notes written in Varner's own hand. Holmes handed me the book. "This is no longer a criminal pursuit, Watson," he said grimly. "It is cultic. Varner believes something waits beneath the water, and he's been trying to reach it, or worse, awaken it." We heard it then. Faint, almost a vibration, a thudding noise from the tunnel behind us. Footsteps. Holmes doused the lantern. We moved to the shadows, waited. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. A voice echoed from the dark just beyond the tunnel mouth, calm, playful. "I told you, Mr. Holmes, seeing doesn't save you, but you've always been a curious man. Too curious." Silence. Then the same voice, closer now, almost at a whisper. "Would you like to see what Caleb found?" Holmes stepped forward, revealing himself. "And what would that be, Varner? Another illusion, a trick with gaslight and shadows?" A laugh, deep and too steady. "No, Mr. Holmes, this time no trick, just the truth. Come to the sea cave at dawn, bring no one. If you wish the widow to live, you will come alone." And then, silence. Holmes turned back to me, face set like stone. He has her. Chapter 9. The Lantern Below. We returned to the surface before first light. The wind had quieted, but the sea had not. It surged and withdrew like a living thing, crashing against the rocks beyond Dagger Point with unusual rhythm. Holmes said little on the walk back to the cottage. I could see the calculation unfolding behind his eyes, swift and merciless. Mrs. Merrow was gone. The front door stood open, one of the hinges twisted unnaturally, as if wrenched by someone impatient with locks. Inside, Talbot lay on the sitting-room floor, conscious but dazed, with a dark welt on his temple. Holmes knelt beside him. "Talbot," he said sharply. "How many?" The inspector blinked. One, masked, tall, came through the back window, moved like he knew the house. I reached for my revolver and... that's all. Holmes stood. She's been taken to the sea caves." "Then we go," I said, immediately reaching for my coat. Holmes held up a hand. "No, I go." "You heard him," Holmes cut in. He was clear. "If I come with anyone else, she dies. I cannot risk her life for my pride." His eyes met mine then, not defiant, but final. "I need you to stay here, Watson. Talbot will recover quickly. If I don't return by noon, I want every constable in Sussex crawling through those cliffs. But until then, wait." There was nothing more to be said. Holmes donned his coat, took only his walking stick and a slim pouch of tools. Before he stepped out the door, he turned to me and added, almost as an afterthought, "If he is what I believe he is, then he will not kill me quickly. He wants something else." The sea caves at Dagger Point were accessible only at low tide, when the water receded enough to reveal the narrow stone path along the cliffs. Holmes knew the way. He had studied the geography before leaving. He walked with the grace of certainty, not fear. The mouth of the cavern yawned like a scar at the base of the cliffs, slick with moss, edges jagged like broken teeth. Holmes ducked inside and descended. The cave narrowed, the walls pulsing faintly with reflected seawater, and then light, lanterns, hung along the tunnel like offerings. Each flickered with an unnatural flame, greenish, almost phosphorescent, as if fed by something more than oil. Holmes followed the trail until it opened into a chamber. At the centre stood a stone plinth, weathered, carved with symbols Holmes recognized from Caleb's journal. On top of it sat a box, old, Russian, intricately designed, and beside it, seated calmly in a chair pulled from above, was Miles Varner. He looked little like the boy Holmes had last seen. Taller now, his face narrow and intelligent, his eyes gleaming with quiet madness. A man who had become the ghost he once pretended to be. "Ah," Varner said, "the curtain rises." "Where is the widow?" Holmes asked. Varner gestured lazily toward a side chamber. "Alive, unharmed, for now. She's seen the relic. She understands now. They all laughed at Caleb, but he was right, wasn't he?" Holmes remained perfectly still. "What are you after, Varner? The box? The legend? Me?" Varner's expression shifted. "I watched you for years, learned from you. But you never believed in the things behind the veil, the things beneath the stones. I do." He tapped the box. "It hums. Caleb wrote about it. It's alive in a way. I've seen what it can do, a light that makes men confess, that shows them what they hide, that burns lies away." Holmes stepped forward, just a pace. "You killed a man for this?" Varner's face turned cold. "He was digging too fast, too loudly. He would have brought the village down here. I needed time." Holmes slowly reached into his coat and retrieved something unexpected, a small mirror. "I've no use for boxes that whisper, but I have something for men like you." Varner laughed once. "Words won't stop me, Holmes." "No," Holmes said, "but your own reflection might." In one swift motion, Holmes flung the mirror toward the plinth. It struck the box, just enough to crack the surface. A sudden shriek split the chamber, not from Varner, but from the box itself. A burst of greenish light flooded the room. The lanterns dimmed, the carvings on the stone plinth lit up like fire. Varner screamed, not in pain, but in fury.
"You fool! You've ruined it!"
Holmes moved quickly, using the moment to rush the side chamber. Mrs. Merrow stood there, bound but conscious. Holmes slashed the ropes. Behind them, Varner still howled, clutching the cracked box as water began to pour through unseen crevices. The chamber trembled, enough to suggest the sea was reclaiming what had been stolen. They barely escaped the tunnel as the tide surged in. By the time they reached the cliffs above, the cave had vanished beneath waves once more. And Varna with it. Back at the cottage, Inspector Talbot greeted their return with disbelief. "Did he die down there?" he asked. Holmes looked toward the sea. "Some men don't die in the usual way, Talbot. Some simply vanish until the next shadow is cast." Chapter 10. Ashes and Answers. 3 days passed before the sea relinquished the caves again. By then, Holmes had already concluded his inquiry in the quiet way he preferred. The official report would state that the suspect, Miles Varner, perished in a cave-in while resisting arrest for multiple crimes, including abduction and tampering with historical relics. No mention was made of glowing lanterns, ancient symbols, or voices that whispered from under the water. Those truths, Holmes said, belonged in a darker sort of ledger. We remained in Hemsley just long enough to attend Caleb Merrow's burial. The body had been retrieved from the cottage cellar with care, and Holmes insisted the man be laid to rest properly beside his father on the chapel grounds. Mrs. Merrow, though shaken, stood with strength as the final prayers were said. I offered her my arm as we left the cemetery, but she turned and looked back, just once, at the shoreline. "Do you think he's really gone?" she asked Holmes quietly. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, "Some men chase knowledge so far into the dark they forget how to come back. I doubt Varner ever truly intended to return." She nodded as if she already knew that. That evening, Holmes sat with the cracked Fabergé box on the desk at Baker Street. The relic had been recovered during the sea's retreat. It no longer hummed nor glowed. Its interior had been gutted, burned clean, as though whatever force had lived within had exhausted itself in a final scream. Holmes held it with surprising care. "It was never Russian," he said. "Not truly. Its design was mimicry, a shell to hide something far older, something placed in the chapel long before the Merrows ever arrived." I leaned forward. "But what was it?" Holmes exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "A device, or perhaps a prison, for memory or madness, or both. Something worshipped or feared. Varner thought he could control it, but I believe he merely gave it room to stretch." He stood then and placed the relic in a small trunk, which he locked and slid beneath the floorboards. "That is where it will stay." We spoke little more of it that night. But as the fire dimmed and the city outside quieted, Holmes said something I have never forgotten. "It is not always the truth that matters most, Watson. Sometimes it is the silence that follows it." The widow never returned to Hemsley. She sold the property to a small trust that planned to preserve the chapel as a site of historical interest. She herself moved to Dorset under a new name. Holmes received a letter from her 6 months later, brief, grateful, and signed simply as Catherine. The lantern, once the symbol of something sacred, was never seen again. Only the waves remember now. So ends another case from the darker pages of Baker Street, one that left more questions buried than uncovered, and a sea that still whispers the name of Miles Varner. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more forgotten cases and whispered mysteries from the mind of Sherlock Holmes, do subscribe to the Drawing Room Detectives. Also let us know, where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing where our fellow sleuths are listening. Until the next adventure, stay curious, stay sharp, and as always, keep your lanterns lit.